spiritual development. Let's go right into this. For you that don't know much about me, these are some of my affiliations right now. I'm a part of the American Family Association and the Alliance for Defending Freedom. And I work also with Frederick Douglass Foundation. I work also here in the Atlanta area with these groups that are part of a one race group. Okay, those are, you may know, Senator Warnock and Andy Stanley. A lot of the other large pastors around the area of large churches attend this group. And I do work with this group with Bishop Hunt too. I'm also part of the Family Research Council, the College of African American Bishops, and a group called Watchmen on the Wall. A group called Watchmen on the Wall is a group that really looks over the churches, provides oversight for churches in their outreaching to the community and ensuring that doctrine and sound doctrine is being taught. Okay, as far as my education, I have a Bachelor's of Arts from Mercer University, Master's Certificate from University of North Carolina at Greensboro in Management, Master's degree in Change Management from Marymount University, and a Doctor of Divinity from Logos University. So like I said, I recently signed contracts right now to be part of Ethnos College. Right now I'm teaching apologetics, which will be on Thursday nights. If you're looking for a college to be a part of, you can go in there. You still can register. Registration is still not closed. And it's a new startup college, and they're only offering, I think, 7 courses now, but the cost is very reasonable. Even you can set up terms there for it. So the dean of the college and the president are good friends of mine, and they'll work out something with you if you're seeking to get a degree to improve your spiritual development. Soldiers drove these Indians out, many of them from Cherokee and the Creek. The Seminoles were driven out of Florida, the Creek, and the Cherokee were driven out of Georgia, and in Alabama and Tennessee, those areas, they were driven out all the way to Oklahoma to be placed on reservations. And literally thousands of them died along the way. And they will only have periodic places where they could stop, and they will allow the Indians to bury their dead. Okay, this is how hard that was. So when the Civil War ended, the attention turned to the West. Okay, during the Civil War, the Army's attention was, focused on fighting the Confederacy. So after the Civil War ended, okay, now the Army can focus now all of their manpower, all their reserve in removing the Indian, because now we need to go west. We want to connect the West Coast with the East Coast. And as the European expanded westward, they clamored for the Army to make their home safe. This is why you had the wagon trains, and you had the forts out there, out west, and things like that. And there were, many times, there were even agreements were made as they went through Indian territories that they would not hunt. They would leave the Indians alone. The Indians would grant passage, but then eventually they drove those Indians off their land. Then you had the Dawes Act, was an effort to make to further assimilate the Indians, and this was aimed to Americanize the Indians. Okay, cultivating them, making them learn English. Okay, and also being placed on other reservations. Many other reservations were further up north in very barren areas. I'm talking about Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota. And if you ever had a chance to visit those states, they are very barren. Okay. The intent of the Dawes Act of 1887, was to break up the tribes and stimulate assimilation of the Indians into the American society. Okay. All the excess land, they pulled that up. They made that open for settlement, and people could claim land. There were land offices that were established. So if you came into a place and there were land offices that were established by the government, you were guaranteed 40 acres. As a white person, white European, you could get your 40 acres and write that and have it recorded, and you can have a deed. The Indians who were here before were not afforded that. Neither were the black man when he was free. He was free, but he didn't get anything, not even 40 acres and a mule. Okay. So what happened to the Chinese? Why did they want to get Chinese out? In the mid 18th century, Chinese immigrants were used for three purposes: for gold mines, in the garment industry, because the Chinese brought in silk and began to make elaborate dresses and things like that. They were great seamstresses, and the men were used to build the railroads and put in the gold mines. And many hundreds of thousands of Chinese died for that. But they were brought in to work, okay? Now, when the work was done, when the railroad was finished, though, the government said, hey, too many of y'all here now. Okay, they came out with a law that even forbidden women coming first. But then the Chinese Inclusion Act came out. President Arthur in 1882 prohibited all immigration of Chinese laborers. They cut it off. And then later they modified that at the beginning of the 19th century, near the end of the 19th century, wherein Chinese workers could only come in unless they had a restaurant. And this is why you have Chinese restaurants everywhere, okay? This is where you have Chinese all over America, okay? Building on the earlier Page Act of 1875, which banned Chinese women from coming there, the Exclusion Act was the only law ever implemented to prevent all members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating to the United States. Just let that sink in. So America's attitude towards slavery, it really began to change when we get the so-called the Dred Scott case. Many of you studied this in high school. They let you study that. But the Dred Scott case of 1857, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court writes in their summary, no rights which any white person has is bound to respect free Black people or tax like whites, but they do not enjoy the same protection and entitlements of white people. This is the Supreme Court, y'all. Okay, the Dred Scott decision, was based on the concept that Dred Scott, who was a freed slave, referred to as a freedman, okay, he resided in a free state and in territory where slavery was prohibited, was not therefore entitled to his freedom. That Americans were not and could never be, African Americans could never be citizens of the United States. And that the Missouri Compromise, which had declared free all territories west of Missouri and north of that latitude, was unconstitutional. The decision added fuel to the sectional controversy and pushed the country closer to civil war. Now, I want to take you there because I want you to think about this. Think about this. The country is expanding, okay? The country is beginning to expand, okay? To open up the West. The people in the South, which was an arrogant society, more agricultural, saw this as an opportunity to expand slavery. And in the northern states, and with the Missouri Compromise, oh no, slavery stops. And now we see the United States becoming more and more divided, okay? So this is what happens when you see this here. And I'm in the South, so I hear different language down here. They talk different down here. And think about this here. A proclamation that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states, the southern states, the Confederate states were referred to as the rebellious states, or henceforth shall be free. The Emancipation Proclamation was signed by President Lincoln in 1863. Okay, now it wasn't really able to be enforced around the country until the end of the Civil War, until the Confederate States were brought back into the Union. This is why they seceded. Okay, now let's look at the Confederacy had their own constitution. I have studied the Constitution of the Confederacy, and I brought this down here. Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, said this: the cornerstone of our new government rests upon the truth, the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. and that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. That is from the mouth of the vice president of the Confederate States. Okay, so we see different nations, different dreams. You see here, the North and the South declared a common history, but they eventually began to become two different nations. One was more arrogant, was more agricultural and everything, cash crops and things like that, and it had little capital, less manufacturing, was debt dependent, favored low tariffs, and opposed direct taxation. The North was more industrialized, okay? And it was the Civil War, not the war between the states. In the South, they loved to use that term, the war between the states. It was not the war between the states. It was the Civil War, okay? Okay, so we see the difference in there. And one reason was that for the expanding of the West and homesteading of that, along with the railroads. And this is what the South really wanted to have. And like I said, in 1863, we have the Emancipation Proclamation, and then the 14th Amendment in 1868 is passed, guaranteeing all citizens equal protection and due process. But then you have 1887 with the Jim Crow laws that began to be passed, codifying a way of a new social order that could be reinforced through violence, intimidation, and segregation in the South, okay? So the sin of our nation, when we look at racism has been the biggest scar on the reputation of America, and the church in particular to this day. Okay, that's from Dr. Van Gaten, one of my college professors. And because of racism within the church as a whole, we've lost its fatuous nature in dealing with racism and prejudice throughout the American culture. Much of your voice has been quiet because the church, the so-called church, never has spoken up about racism. And the church really should be one that really carried this call. It shouldn't have been all that responsibility that ended up falling on Martin Luther King, okay? Now we see the Civil War has ended, and now the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, okay? Their core belief is to restore America back to being white. You heard that? They want America to be back to being white and controlled by white. They were, the nation to be free from, they say today, from drugs, homosexuality, immigration, and race mixing, which groups attributes to the country's downfall. Okay, they take a lot of pride there in the ideology of the superiority of the white race, and it was social and nationally accepted, even in the 1920s with the movie Birth of a Nation, which was shown at the White House on their website. Even today, they're proud of their race, their history, their traditions. They refer to their acts of the past, as trying to make a better country and culture and society for everybody if everybody just stayed in their place. So after the Civil War, you think about this, or you go back a little bit in history, President Lincoln is he's assassinated, and then his vice president takes over. He's from the South. He's not a President Lincoln, okay? Andrew Johnson is not that. So we have a period called Reconstruction. That is a period where the Union soldiers are sent to the South to protect the rights of the Black people, or the new referred to as free men. They were called free men, okay? They have the right to vote, ensured that they had the right to vote. There were federal troops occupying the South. And this is why many people hated the government back then, because the government actually occupied the South for those 12 years, okay? So we look at Reconstruction, and there's some good things about Reconstruction, but then there are awful things about Reconstruction. The Union was restored, the Southern economy begins to rebuild, African Americans, they attain their their citizenship. They get a chance to vote. You have more Black people in the office than ever before in history. Okay, the Freedmen's Bureau helped the education. They began to build schools for Black people. Housing and jobs were made available. Other than slavery, people had to be educated into work because that's all they had known was being a slave. So they developed this public school system for Black kids. The failures are the distribution of wealth and power in the South remained unchanged. Many of the Southerners are caught in a cycle of poverty. Okay, Southern governments limit African American voting. Okay, racism continues in the North and the South, and many Southerners remain bitter toward the federal government and the Republican Party for what they had did, because they really they didn't trust the government. Any of that sound familiar today? So we see what happened with Reconstruction. It was one of the most prosperous times for minorities in America. Okay, that level of influence has never been surpassed right now. Okay, but we see the rise of the KKK, increase in violence after the troops were pulled out in 1877, and then up to that we have 3,959 Black people so far that we know who were lynched and killed during that time by the KKK. And then reason why Reconstruction failed is because of the Great Compromise. President Grant was not allowed to run for a third term, okay? And the next election was basically in a deadlock. And you have with the Compromise of 1877, where the Southern Democrats would acknowledge that Hayes would be the president, but only on understanding that Republicans would meet their 5 demands, okay? The removal of all troops from the South, the appointment of at least one Democratic, Southern Democrat to Hayes' cabinet, okay? And the construction of another transcontinental railroad through the South and Texas, the legislation to help industrialize the South and restore its economy, restoring Reconstruction and the South, and that include reparations for the white slave owners who lost slaves. So the government gave them reparations, okay? And the right to deal with the African-American citizens in the Southern states without the Northern interference, interference. So this, we heard that a lot during the 60s when Martin Luther King was there. People were referred to as outside agitators. They did not want any interference. Let us handle our Negroes ourselves. We'll take care of our Black people, okay? And they took care of them all right. Okay, so we see the start of segregation. And even in 1896, we see what the Supreme Court did. It upheld separate but equal, okay? And the federal government takes it to the next level in 1813. President Woodrow Wilson had a chance to change things. He didn't, okay? And we did not get integration until the 1960s. And the election of a first Black Democrat to Congress until that decade in Massachusetts. So all that while. So we had from Reconstruction all the way to the 1960s before the first Black person was ever elected to any office. So now we have here, how do we control the Black people? It was through one was called the Black Codes initially. Before you had Jim Crow, you had the Black Codes. They were harsher than Jim Crow, okay? They were made for Black people who were arrested for anything. If you didn't have a job, you were arrested. You were put on the chain gang. You were put on public works things, okay? Okay, you got penalized for not changing your job. You didn't have paperwork on you to show that you had a job, okay? You couldn't testify against white people in court. All this started with the Black Codes. Then the Black Codes went on to Jim Crow, okay? The Black Codes were outlawed in the 14th Amendment, but by the Reconstruction Act, but the Black Codes were a violation of the 14th Amendment. However, white Southerners, determined to keep things separate, came up with the concept of Jim Crow, okay, and called for separations of races in daily life. And that lasted almost 100 years. Jim Crow laws were state and local, reinforcing racial segregation in the South. And, they were mandated through all the way through with the term separate but equal. Okay, you could keep things separate, but they had to be equal. So if you had a water fountain, you had to have two. One could be for color, one could be for white. If you had to have bathrooms, okay, you had to have a colored bathroom and a white bathroom. They call that separate but equal. That's what Jim Crow was all about. So then, as we see now, the Black church now, the growth of the Black church. The Black Church of America was created before the American Revolution, around 1758, and it was called the Bluestone Church, an African Baptist church. Actually, it was founded in Virginia, okay, in Mecklenburg, Virginia, by William. It was founded actually. William Byrd Plantation gave up land to establish the Black church, and then during this time of all of this duress, we ended up with two societies in America, especially in the South, but it was mainly all over the country. In America, United States, it was a Black and white country for many years. The so-called race riots, they were called race riots, but they were nowhere close to a riot. These were massacres, okay? Wilmington, Delaware, okay? It happened there, where you had one of the strongest middle class of Black people that owned many things there. Many of the buildings, many of the businesses were owned by Blacks there. In 1898, the violence began on a Thursday, November 10th, and the African-American city there, okay, it was one of the, on the eastern seaboard, it's one of the largest metropolis of Blacks owned. And, many Blacks were killed. In Forsyth County, in Georgia, the northern county of Georgia, in called Forsyth County, one of Georgia's 10 most populous, leans heavily white and conservative now. But in the demographics are shaped by the event that happened in 1912 when white people forced all of them out. All of the citizens were forced out. Over in 1,100 Black citizens, which was 10% of the population at that time, meaning they were all forced out of there. Many of the Black businesses during that time moved into Loganville. I remember as a child, Rosewood in Florida. Many of us have heard about that. They even made a movie about that. Many people say there were up to 150 that were killed. But in all of these instances, people were slaughtered and all of their businesses were destroyed. It was not just the people being killed, but their businesses were destroyed, okay? And of all the southern states, many people would think that Mississippi was the worst, but Florida had more lynchings than any other state in America. And many of the most famous one is in Tulsa, Black Wall Street, 1921, mobs of white citizens. Most of these were perpetrated because someone had said something about someone had raped a white woman and did something to a white woman. And this enraged people and justified them to go and do those things, okay? And to come up against it. Another thing too is many people feared the Black men that returned from World War I. As Black men returned from World War I, they came back from World War I, they were weapons trained, they had weapons, okay? This sent fear in the heart of many of the whites because now we don't just have these dumb Negroes there now, we need to control them. And they have weapons now and they know how to use those weapons, okay? And so, but there at Black Wall Street, they said that, over 20 city blocks were destroyed. They had movie theaters, they had theaters and everything there. All that area was destroyed. Over 300 people were killed. And it's even said that they even used, the government planes were used to bomb certain parts of the city, okay? So it's really, when you look at that, attitudes change after World War II. After World War II, you have the birth of the NAACP. Like I said, Black men come back. Black men have had a taste of how they were treated in Europe as equals, and they come back to America and they're treated different. I got a picture, and my here that I cherish a lot of my grandfather, John H. Reid Sr. He served in World War One, and when I found out that he did it, I asked him before he passed away, why you never talked about that, Granddad? Why you never told us you served in World War One? And he told me a story that when he came back from World War One, he went in World War One, went over in the middle of 1917, went into France and left in 1919. They put them on the ship. They kept them separate. They kept them in the bottom of the ship, separate from the white soldiers. And when they came and put them on trains to come, when they got into Maryland, they told them, okay, boys, take them uniforms off and put these overalls on. We going in the South now, y'all boys. And he had his uniform on. He had all of his medals on. He was so proud of what he had done in World War One. And he took his uniform off and put those overalls on. And he said, he looked at me, and the only time I ever saw my granddaddy with a tear in his eye, he said, I never put that uniform on again. I put it in a box and I never looked back at it, John. And like, wow, you know, I could actually feel his pain. And I never asked him about that again. Okay. But we have this movie that really come out there too at the time after that, after these soldiers come back, Birth of a Nation. If you have a chance to watch that, a horrible movie, it was a blockbuster in Hollywood. It was shown at the in the White House. During that time, over 20,000 members of the Ku Klux Klan marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., because the president was an unauthorized member of the Ku Klux Klan also too. Okay, so this is what happened there. So the movie was called The Klansman, written by D.W. Griffin and all, and it portrayed the Klan as being these knights. That's where you refer to them as the knights of the Ku Klux Klan, who were there to save people from the Negro men who were thugs and rapists and things like that, protecting the glory of the white woman. That's what the movie was all about. Okay, so we see separate but equal begin to come. Now I'm about to wrap this up. We see white, we see colored. Okay, and unfairness continued, and this is where you begin to see the separation of wealth. And the separation of wealth is very important when you look at race, racism. In 1935, Congress passes the Social Security Act, okay? But people who worked on farms and domestic workers, which most Black women at the time worked as maids, or they cleaned, or they worked in dry cleaners, they didn't have access to these benefits. In 1944, the GI Bill was passed. It excluded Blacks who served in World War I and World War II. Okay, it was enacted to help the World War II veterans return back and give them low-cost mortgages, low-interest loans, and everything else, because there was a great big housing boom and baby boom, because I'm one of those baby boomers. Okay, and nearly 9 million veterans received close to $4 billion of benefits, all to the exception and exclusion of people of color. You hear me? Okay, and that's really shocking, you know. And like I said, Black GIs were denied those rights to build when they would first start the concept of suburbs and buying these homes. They established, moreover, they established what we call redlining, where only certain places where Black people were actually allowed to even buy and own property, and even to borrow money to get a house. Many Black people had to go to their own institutions, which were referred to as savings and loans. That's right. Black people couldn't go to the banks in the South. You had to have the savings and loans. You don't see those no more. My sister Helen, she probably remembers that. But there used to be savings and loans of all places. And these were mainly people that really took care of Black people. And if you had to have a house built, which my mother built our first home on Anthony Road in Macon, Georgia, we had to go through Black contractors because a white contractor would not work for you. Okay, so the GI Bill believed to be one piece of it that spurred the growth of the American middle class. So that the American middle class really was launched through the GI Bill. 1954, we had Brown versus the Board of Education. It really went out to strike down the laws of separate but equal and called them unconstitutional. But many schools didn't integrate until the 1970s. Okay. President Eisenhower, I don't think he gets a lot of the credit that he should. I don't know, many people don't look in because he was a Republican president, but he built the interstate highways, and then he sent the National Guard into Arkansas to ensure that the Little Rock Nine, those kids were able to desegregate the schools there. That was all of what he did. President Eisenhower will piggyback on what Truman had did, integrated the armed forces of the United States of America. Okay, but think about it again. It's not my fault, but it's my problem. Okay. Laws don't change hearts. You have the 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act, 68 Fair Housing Act. Okay, and we went to 2008, where we had our first Black president. We served 2 terms, but it still don't turn the hearts of people. I mean, we had redlining that still exists today. You still have gerrymandering. That means that district lines are drawn so that white candidates can be elected. Do you know, I want to share this with you, that the state of Mississippi, it is 2022. The Black population in Mississippi is 15% higher than the white population. Yet there has never been a state elected Black official in the state of Mississippi. Just let that sink in a little bit. You know who's right behind them? Right behind them, the state of Arkansas. Okay, no Black state elected officials, very few. Okay, I'm not talking about local city mayors or that. I'm talking about to the state legislature, to the federal level, and things like that. Nothing. Okay, out of those states. Okay, so we have the Fair Housing Act that outlined it, that began to attack redlining, but we still have a lot of gerrymandering going on. Okay, and one thing that's hurting the church today, as I go back into this now, is a term that really came about in the last 10 years. And it's called Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism, I think, is one of the, I'm sorry, my computer is going crazy, focuses on passing laws and view Christianity as a role politically and socially, and wherein Christians have been tied to political parties. And this should never be so. Okay, I declare myself as an independent. I mean, you got to win my vote. I'm not going to vote Democrat blindly. I'm not going to vote Republican blindly. You got to win my vote. Okay, that's the way I see it. And I'm not going to look past moral issues either. So the term Christian nationalism has really hurt the church because it's turned off the millennials and the Generation Z people away from being Christians, because they feel that Christians are pushing their rights on the other people. And this is why we had the big blowout in the country. And I never expected this from Christians with the Roe versus Wade, with the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And I saw Christians just literally going after each other on Facebook because they wanted to kill their own children. I mean, it was just really crazy. But people saw this as a civil right. Okay, and so we have to be very careful. And I view everything, when that comes to, I view things through the word. I don't look at things culturally. I look at things through the word of God. Okay, so why does racism thrive? I'm gonna wrap this up in the last 3 minutes here. The Confederate fight in the war between the states was heroic. They believed that. It's called the lost cause ideology. You probably heard that, the lost cause. Enslaved people were happy and content in their environment, and And the lost cause ideology says that slavery was not the cause of the Civil War. Okay. And the Daughters of the Confederacy, they initiated the ideology of the lost cause. They initiated the erection of statues, monuments. They wrote the textbooks for the next generations. Okay, they retold the story of the Civil War, and they indoctrinated the youth today and upcoming generations about race relations. Okay, this is why we still have a problem with racism, not just in the South, but in our country. Okay, so they rewrote those women got together to do this. We see that the Black church was born out of protest and piety. Okay, reasons for division in the Black church. We look at the church, there are divisions right now still existing in the Black church. I'm going to show you a slide that's a few minutes to show you the difference. I've worked with both churches. I've worked in white churches. I worked in Black churches. I've been in leadership in both. And I can tell you this, they are distinctly different. Okay. Okay. When we look at evolution and Darwin's theory, cultural imperialism, which is part of white supremacy, and then we see the resurgence of nationalism and things like that. What we call the Great Migration, which happened in 1910 to 1970 because of Jim Crow. Many people left the South. They went to Detroit. They went to Chicago. They went to get jobs because people just couldn't take it no more. They left Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, those places, and went to the North. Okay, and this is what's happening right now in the church today. Okay, these are some signs that's been there. And on just some church sides, Black folks need to stay out of white churches. Black people have been asked to leave white churches when they visit. Okay, so we see that there are two distinct churches. Okay, the white evangelical church and things like that, they fight tooth and nail for an unborn child, but won't lift a finger to assist the child once the child is born. Okay, so we see differences here. The Black church here is, well, as we look at them, is mostly very strong praise and worship, which culturally based, because the church was our culture. When I was coming up, church was our culture, child. You can say what part of Africa you're from. You can say you were an Italian American. You can say you were French American, but church was your culture. Church was your community. And now these things are gone. In the Black community that we see today in our culture, when we see the young people today, we don't see that. We don't see the culture embracement. We don't see community oriented. We don't see the connection with family, okay? Because we had family that wedding blood, but they were called your family. Social justice, equality is really reinforced more so in the Black church. Revivalist piety, and racial protest. These are all pillars of the Black church. And the white church, praise and worship, but they strongly reinforce in doctrine because it require all their pastors, all preachers have to be college educated. These churches are all planted. Many Black churches are formed within themselves. They strongly believe in leadership development. I have participated in leadership development in some white churches, and their community organized more strongly. Okay, when we look at systematic racism, this is just a little model of you to show you there how things work. Where you come from based on your tax system. Black kids, if you go to a school there and your school doesn't have a strong tax base within your district, if many of the houses there are Section 8 or they're supported by the government, the tax base is not going to be there. The schools are going to be worse. Okay, and you're in another side of town where people are much more affluent. They have more tax funds running there. Plus, they have federal tax funds too. Those schools are going to be much more better and things like that. So these kids start out with on the wrong foot about schools. So we need to kill the N-word. Okay, I want you to think about this. Why do we continue to use this word? It's a detrimental to society. It hurts either race, and it appears our young people won't let it go. But we think about what Jesus did. Jesus attacked every aspect of discrimination, even in the Bible. Okay, Jesus said, I must need to go through Samaria. And Samaria is a place of racial and ethnic tension in the Bible, all the way through. And even when Jesus left, some of the last words he said, you shall receive power after you receive the Holy Ghost, and you would go into Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and all the othermost parts of the world. They were told to go to Samaria, okay? And these people were of a mixed blood. They were called, they could have been just like the N-word back then. And guess what Jesus does? Jesus engages a woman of Samaria, okay? So we are told to do these things, and it's biblical. Okay, we look at that. Martin Luther King letters from a Birmingham jail. I challenge you, take the time to read that. And when he begins to express his rhetoric there in paper to the clergy, to the white clergy especially, about their need to stop the way that their brothers are being treated. The human law, that human law is fair only when it allows citizens to develop their human nature. Under civil law, everyone ought to be treated equally and are entitled to the freedom of conscience. He makes an appeal in that letter. It reads just like scripture when you read the letters from a Birmingham jail, because Dr. Martin Luther King was a theologically trained pastor, which there weren't many back then, but he was a theologically trained and astute man of God at that time. When we look at the population, it's right here based on 2018 numbers. Actually, the African American part has reduced to less than 12%. Like I had said earlier, I talked to you about how the poor whites were put in positions to oversee the blacks. This started with what? Overseers, constables. You had the military watches, slave patrols, and then eventually law enforcement went to marshals, who were over federal appointed territories, sheriffs who were locally elected, and local police who served within certain cities. So this is what we see, the progression of the American police officer. And we see now the partisanship that's happening in our country, where we have people that don't get along just because of political party. Blacks and whites don't get along, and how the nationalization of the police has occurred, militarization of police. We see the stereotypes that people hold when they see a black man. Many times what the scene on the left is what they see when they see a guy going down the street with a do-rag around the do-rag on his head, and with his shirt off or gold chains on. They see that, and many of our young people reinforce that stereotype instead of seeing this guy as being who he is. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, fundamentally, the problem of race is a matter of spirit. The church is uniquely equipped to address this here, but it's a denial of the existence of personhood of a person based upon their race. And much of the church's voice has been too silent in this here. Okay, it starts with each one of us. It happens at the ballot box. We have to get involved in government at every level. We have to engage, reconcile, and healing through each other and prayer. This is how we bring about change. And I want to close with this scripture. If anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? And this commandment we have from him, that he who loves God must love his brother also. Okay, well, I just want to leave that with you today. If you got